So thank you for joining us for this webinar. This session is going to be about all 4 sections of Chapter 6 in the textbook, which is about humans in the biosphere. If you're here live, you're going to see questions pop up as polls once in a while, and you should answer those. Just so you know, nobody can see your individual answers, just the entire group's score. So don't be afraid to answer if you're not sure what the answer is. And these questions are just for practice. They're not graded. They're not submitted in any way. And if you're watching a recording of this later, then you can just kind of follow along with the questions. You don't have to turn them in any way. And if you're here live, you can ask questions. If you're on a computer, you should have a little speech bubble. And if you're on a phone, you have this question icon or tablet. And those will bring up a section where you can type questions to me. So you could do that at any point if you want me to go back and review something again, or you have more questions about a certain topic, or you have more questions about something else in this lesson. Don't hesitate to ask. You're not going to be interrupting at all. Just send your questions and I will be sure to answer them. This whole chapter is about the ways that humans affect the world around them. No other species comes close to changing the environment as much as humans do. And this is a great concern because not only are the actions of humans affecting other life on the planet, but we are affecting the sources of our resources. Humans rely on the environment for food and water and raw materials, and we're changing it an awful lot. Agriculture is the process of growing and raising food, and humans depend on it. And as the worldwide human population has grown, we have made changes to the way that food is farmed. Machinery, fertilizers, pesticides, genetic modification, and other modern farming practices have allowed humans to get more crops than ever before. However, changing land from natural habitat to farmland has large effects on the biosphere. The practice of planting monocultures, giant fields of one single crop, that affects the ecosystem, and then the chemicals and machinery that we use also affects the ecosystem. And again, this is not just a concern for other species that live here, but for ourselves. This affects our drinking water, our atmosphere, and our own food. Development is the spreading of human communities into areas that had a natural ecosystem before. And unsustainable development is a problem. The spread of cities takes up farmland. The dense amount of people create a lot of waste. That's really hard to deal with all of it. And we're taking up land that was once wilderness, and that leaves no habitat left for other species. A particularly bad habit is developing near coasts and draining wetlands. So wetlands help filter our drinking water, and they provide a buffer for storms and floods, but we drain them away and build on them, or build developments out into the water with no buffer zone at all. Like you can see in this picture in Florida. So sustainable development is when development is planned carefully to avoid problems like this. Resources are anything that we require, and there are 2 types. There are non-renewable resources, which are things that are not replaced when we use them. Things like oil and coal and minerals and metals mined from the ground. They're not reusable. They don't come back when we're done with them. Renewable resources are resources that we don't use up when we use them. Things like sunlight and wind and the energy from waves or a river. And then you have trees and other living things that are generally considered renewable because we can replace them if we use them sustainably. For example, we take some of the trees from the forest, but not all, and plant new ones in their place. That's sustainable use of it, and it's keeping those trees as a renewable resource. And just as some examples, again, non-renewable is anything that gets used up as we use it and we have no way to replace it. So coal would be an example. Oil, natural gas, anything mined out of the ground is probably a non-renewable resource. Running river and solar energy are examples of renewable resources, and those are ones that are particularly obvious because they're not used up when we use them. Whether or not we harness the sun's energy and use it to make electricity, the sun's still going to keep giving us energy. Whether or not we have a dam in the river with a generator in it, the river's still going to keep running. So we don't reduce the amount that's there by using it. So that's actually the end of section 1. So we have a review question, and there's going to be a poll on your screen, and there is more than one answer. I'll tell you that now. So your question is, which of these are non-renewable resources? Metals mined from the ground, solar power, wind power, and oil. Which are non-renewable? It'll give you about 30 seconds to answer that poll. Okay, we didn't need the 30 seconds. Good job, everyone. So yes, we have the correct answers. That, oh wait, um, maybe I said it wrong or we got it backwards, but we have the backwards answers. So non-renewable are the metals mined from the ground, and oil, where if we use it up, it doesn't come back. We don't have any more. Those are non-renewable. Solar power and wind power are renewable. So I'm not sure why we got it backward. All of the students answered and got the questions backwards there. So just in case, I'll go back and review. Non-renewable are things that are not replaced when we use them. Things like coal and oil, we burn them up and they're gone and that's it. Renewable are ones that don't get used up when we use them. So there's still the same amount there whether we use it or not. You could also count things as renewable that we can replace, things like trees, where yes, we could use them and that tree is gone, but we could just plant another tree, and as long as we do it sustainably, that could be renewable. So the next section talks about a lot about soil. Soil is a resource that you may not think much about, but it is incredibly important. Everything that you eat grew from a plant in the soil, or as an animal that ate plants that grew in the soil. But growing plants, especially at the intense rate of modern agriculture, uses up the soil's nutrients. It takes them away. So soil that is not well protected can not only become bad for farming, but it could also be eroded where the wind or water can move it away and then it's not there to use anymore. The Dust Bowl is an example of the result of unsustainable resource use. So in the 1930s, large areas of the Midwest, which had been farmed using poor farming practices that loosened up and dried up the soil, these areas were also hit by an intense drought. And so the topsoil dried up and literally blew away, and the area became very much like a desert, with dry soil blowing into dunes like desert sands. And the process of this happening is called desertification. And this process happens in other places around the world too, both naturally and from humans over farming. And these are just some more pictures of the Dust Bowl. So the left is a map showing where it occurred. So lots of parts of Kansas and Texas and a little bit of Oklahoma, New Mexico, Colorado, and Nebraska were affected. And these are just some images showing a giant dust storm blowing in, dunes of dust, dirt, dried up dirt that are higher than this little house or building here. And the bottom one is another dust storm coming in. So it was definitely a terrible time. It really decreased the amount of food that could be grown. And since then, we've learned from it, and there's much better farming practices that take better care of the soil. Deforestation is also something that harms soil. Forests help rich soil form, and they help keep that soil in place. The roots of plants are really good at keeping soil in place. So removing the forests can lead to soil erosion, and it could be so bad that the trees or crops can never grow there again if all of the soil gets wiped away. So farming and forestry are two areas where those in the industry must really focus on sustainability and try to balance being sustainable with meeting our needs. Otherwise, the soil will not be available to meet our needs in the future. Fresh water is another resource that we must be careful not to abuse. While water is never destroyed in the water cycle, the amount of available drinking fresh water is limited. Damaging ecosystems that filter the water can be a problem, and we could also use up water faster than it can be replaced. And this is currently happening in the American Midwest. Water from melting glaciers was stored underground. The area is called an aquifer. There's a lot of groundwater there, and it is replenished by rain and snow every year, but we are using it for irrigation much, much faster than it could be refilled. So this unsustainable use of water to grow our food could lead to a crisis. That same amount of water is not going to ever come back because we don't have glaciers there to melt and put the water back, and we're using it faster than it could be replenished by the rain and snow. So the water level is constantly decreasing, and eventually we could run out. There are many types of water pollution that affect the environment in different ways, and they could be from point sources, such as discharge from a factory, or this discharge from a copper mine that's turning the stream orange, or non-point solutions, which come from many places at once, such as runoff from farms or fields, or litter washing into a stream. One major concern with water pollution is biological magnification. And this is when a pollutant enters the body of an animal or plant and it stays there. So when that animal or plant is eaten, the pollutant moves to the body of the animal that ate it, and it stays there. And every time the animal eats an affected plant or animal, which may be throughout its entire life it's eating them, the amount of chemical in its body builds up. And because a predator will eat a lot of prey in its lifetime, it gets pollutants from each one, and that makes the pollutants higher and higher in concentration in each level of the food chain. Okay, so you have something on the bottom of the food chain that has a little bit of the pollutant in it. The next thing eats several of those throughout its lifetime, so it builds up. The next thing eats several of those throughout its lifetime, so it builds up in its body. The top thing in the food chain keeps just eating these infected meals, and it builds up in that animal's body. So this famously happened with the pesticide chemical called DDT, which built up in fish and killed the eagles that ate the fish. And not every pollutant and chemical goes through biological magnification, but those that do can ruin entire ecosystems this way. So that's water pollution, and then the atmosphere. The atmosphere is a resource because we breathe in air, and because changes in the atmosphere can have many negative effects. Air pollution comes in a lot of forms. It's most visible as smog, which is just a gross haze that forms in the air in cities when different air pollutants react with each other. Smog causes breathing problems in many people, and many cities have like a smog index in their weather forecast to tell how bad it would be outside that day. Similarly, particulates are tiny pieces of ash and dust floating in the air. Acid rain is caused by air pollution. The chemicals in the air from burning fossil fuels makes the rain acidic. And this is a real problem as the acidity damages plants and changes the soil as it rains down onto the forest and the soil all day. Burning fossil fuels also adds greenhouse gases to the air. These increase the amount of heat that Earth's atmosphere holds in, which raises the temperature of the Earth. And humans have also released pollutants into the atmosphere that decrease the amount of ozone in the atmosphere, thus allowing more ultraviolet light to get through the atmosphere to Earth. So I know this is a pretty dense slide. There's a lot of text on it. Just take a second to read over everything. If you're watching the video, definitely pause, take some notes, come back to it if you need to. But these are all forms of air pollution or effects of air pollution. Okay, and another review question. Okay, so which of the following is not commonly associated with air pollution? Let me bring up the poll here. Okay, so it looks like we still need votes from a few more people. I'll give you about 10 more seconds to think about it. Again, you should answer even if you're not completely sure, because um, the answers just come in as the group's answers. I can't see who answered which answers. No one else can. So if you're not sure of the answer, that's okay. No one will see your answer. All right, and we got 100% of people voted. Awesome. And most people, looks like most people got it right. Most answers were the correct answer of colder temperatures. So acid rain comes from air pollution. Again, it's burning fossil fuels, puts the chemicals in the air that make the rain acidic. Air pollution causes a lot of breathing problems, especially smog and particulates cause breathing problems. Smog is a form of air pollution that happens when one kind of pollution interacts with another kind of pollution and sunlight and then makes this smog. So the only one that's not is colder temperatures, and that's because air pollution actually warms the climate. Greenhouse gases that we put into the air are what are responsible for climate change, and we generally see that as a warming, not as a cooling. So great job, everybody. We're going to move on to this last section here. So biodiversity is important to ecosystems. Biodiversity means all of the differences between living things. So this could mean ecosystem diversity, which is different types of ecosystem in the world, so everything from a desert to a forest to a tundra and everything in between. Biodiversity could mean species diversity, the number of different species in an ecosystem. For example, these fish living on a reef. You can see there's lots of different species there. These fruits that all came from the same forest, so that's representing that's representing a small number of the plants in the forest. There's much more than that also. And another form of biodiversity is genetic diversity within species. So, within a species, there's individuals that have different traits. So an example would be all of these um, varieties of maize that are the same species, but you could tell they've got different colors and shapes, and they probably taste different. Or these dachshunds that are all not only the same species, but even the same breed of dog, and they have very different features, different traits. So that's an example of genetic diversity within species. So all of those three concepts are part of the idea of biodiversity. And biodiversity is important to ecosystems. The genetic diversity in a species fosters adaptation and evolution, and it keeps the populations healthy. If there's a disease, genetic diversity is going to help some individuals survive. Species diversity allows ecosystems to thrive in all environments on Earth. And biodiversity is also important to humans. One way is that we've got a lot of resources from living things, so having a diverse amount of living things at our disposal is helpful. Many medicines, particularly, are derived from natural organisms, so a lot of biodiversity gives us many potential sources. And biodiversity is important to agriculture to maintain disease resistance. Again, if there's a disease um, that affects some members of a population, it's best if the population has a lot of differences so that some of them end up surviving the disease. And of course, to breed for certain traits. If we want fruit to be a certain color or a certain size or to have a certain taste, we want our animals to be bigger and have larger muscles, then that's what we can breed for. But we can only do that if the genetic diversity is there to work with. So even though we know biodiversity is important to humans, humans do many things to threaten the biodiversity of the ecosystem around us. So one way that we do that is to alter habitats, turning natural habitats into cities or farmland. This drives out many species. It can cause them to go extinct, and it also um, can result in habitat fragmentation, which means that there is existing habitat, but it's broken up into small areas. This may overcrowd the animals, not give them enough space, or put dangerous areas such as highways in the path of animals that move from place to place. So some examples of that you can see in this picture on the left. There are some kind of open field areas, and then they're surrounded on three sides by development that's going to be housing and businesses. And you can see on the right, you've got a highway running right next to the water. So if animals go to the water to drink or swim, hunt for food down there, to get back to the rest of the forest, they have to cross over a highway. So that's habitat fragmentation. We're putting them in danger and affecting their lives by having human stuff in the way. But that's just one of the ways that humans decrease biodiversity. We also do that by hunting species until they're endangered or extinct. For example, the dodo bird was hunted to extinction, polluting the environment so much that species cannot live there, such as this dead coral reef. And changing the climate, which changes temperature and rainfall. That's going to affect a lot of habitats and ecosystems where things live. We are doing that through polluting the air and adding greenhouse gases to the environment. And um, another way is introducing new species into an ecosystem, which I'll talk about some more on the next slide. So those are all ways that humans can threaten biodiversity. Introducing a new species to an ecosystem can be a huge problem. Sometimes the species can't live there and it just dies, or occasionally it fits relatively well into the existing ecosystem, but that's not usually the case. Often the new species doesn't have anything in the new ecosystem to hold its population numbers in check, so the can grow very quickly and outnumber the species that are supposed to live there. And when this happens, the new species is called an invasive species. It could throw off the balance of the whole ecosystem and threaten native species. So there's some examples of that on the bottom of the screen. On the left, we have zebra mussels. And these are tiny little mussels that came from, I think, southern Russia, if I remember correctly, or areas over there. And they got introduced into the United States, and they just breed out of control. And not only are they threatening the other wildlife that lives in places where they've been introduced, they clog up um, everything. They clog up drainage pipes, they ruin boats, they just kind of coat everything with zebra mussels. So they're pretty terrible. There's a lot of efforts to keep them from spreading any farther. They're all in our Great Lakes and other lakes in the northern part of the United States mostly, and they're spreading further and further south. So they're a real concern. In the middle, we have kudzu, which is a plant that came from somewhere in Asia, and it's somewhere where it gets cold in the winter and kills it off in the winter. It can't keep growing. And so it's not a problem over there. It grows and then it dies off, and then the next year it just grows and dies again, and that's fine. It got brought to America because someone thought it was pretty. And in the American South, where the winter doesn't get very cold, it just grows and grows and grows and it covers everything. So this is a whole forest covered in kudzu. You can see pictures of it just covering entire landscapes and buildings and everything. Um, Really a problem species. And the one on the right is similar. It's called hydrilla. It's a plant that lives in the water. And the same thing, it was brought here and there was nothing to hold it in check. And so it's just growing through our waterways in the south. Okay, so not everything that humans do is horrible. There are a variety of conservation efforts to preserve biodiversity. There are breeding programs designed to breed members of individual species and release them into the wild. So, for example, several zoos have breeding programs for pandas, and on the right here is a condor egg being incubated. California condors were almost extinct a couple decades ago, and they've been bringing them back successfully. Species with low populations are listed as threatened or endangered, and in most countries it's illegal to harm them or disrupt their homes. Parks and preserves are areas set aside as protected areas to remain as large natural habitats. And there are many laws preventing or limiting the amount of pollutants that can go into the ecosystem and encouraging environmentally friendly practices. Oh, so we've got a review question here. I'm going to share that as a poll. Oh, no, I'm not. I didn't make that as a poll. I'm sorry. All right, so just kind of follow along with this one. Which of these is not an effort to help maintain biodiversity? Habitat fragmentation, captive breeding programs, national parks, or laws preventing endangered species? So I'll give you a few seconds just to think about it, decide what your answer is, and then we'll see together which is the correct answer. Okay, so the only one that's not an effort to help is habitat fragmentation. Remember, habitat fragmentation, it's making fragments out of a habitat, it's splitting it up, and that affects the animals that live there negatively. It's kind of ruining their home. The other three, again, are ways that humans are helping to try to um, keep the species that we have and allow them to live in normal habitats. Okay, and the chapter ends talking about ecological footprints. So how much do you think you affect the biosphere? If you think about it, you could think about the resources you use and how you directly affect everything. But the effect that you have as a person living on the earth is probably more than you think, because the effect that you have on the biosphere includes the food that you eat and the water you drink and the waste you produce and the energy that you use and all of the resources that went into the home that you live in and the objects that you use. Remember that all of this has to come from somewhere in nature. Even something like a phone that you think of as metal and plastic and glass, all of that had to come from somewhere and take energy to um, be created or be mined, and energy to turn it into what it is, and energy to ship it to the store and then ship it to your house, and then you use it, and that requires energy. So every little thing in your life is something that requires lots of different resources. So remember, all of that had to come from somewhere in nature, and one thing that ecologists do is to roughly calculate the total area of land and water ecosystems that were needed to produce everything that you use. So that land area is called an ecological footprint. So again, it's the amount of land that was used to make everything that you use. And an individual person's ecological footprint is hard to calculate. It's nearly impossible to calculate exactly, but there's estimates that we can use. And the ecological footprint of individuals in the United States are definitely larger than individuals in any other country. And to kind of go along with it, this is a satellite image showing farming in, I believe this one's Kansas. So each of those grids and circles on there is a farm. You can see it, there's light colors and dark colors because some are growing wheat and some are growing corn and some are growing soybeans and other crops. But each one of those is a farm. They're pretty densely packed. That is part of the ecological footprint. That's land that's being used to produce food. And in general, ecologists try to solve problems that humans create for the environment and the atmosphere by following three general steps. Recognize the problem, find the cause of that problem, and then change behavior to eliminate the cause of that problem. And this, of course, is really hard to do in a complex world, especially when people don't agree on the cause of the problem or are unwilling to agree to the suggested changes in behavior, but sometimes it can be done successfully. So your text goes through the details of three different cases where this problem-solving strategy is being used in the real world. So I would suggest not skipping those last pages of the text, read those different case studies. And one last poll question. What is an ecological footprint? Is it the amount of resources you use, the amount of land and water that are needed to create the resources you use, the amount of electricity used by an average family, or the amount of food eaten by an average family? So we still need a few votes. I'll give you a few more seconds. Okay, and looks like almost everybody voted, and almost everybody got it right. So it was an ecological footprint, the amount of resources you use. Close, but it's more specific. It's the amount of land and water that were required to produce the resources that you use. So you're not just adding up, all the food and the fuel and raw materials that you use. You're looking at how much land was required to make them. And the other two are part of it. The amount of electricity that you use, the amount of food or eaten, that's stuff that would go into calculating it, but this second option here is the total. And that brings us to the end of the presentation. If you're watching it on video and you have any questions, here's ways you can contact your instructor.